Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and of course a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Elizabeth Townsend Guard. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School, and I just want to quilt. With Bonnie Browning. She is the executive show director for the American Quilter Society, and they are the group that puts on the Spring Show in Paducah and a bunch of shows all around the country. But we are headed to Paducah in a few weeks, and so we thought we'd chat with her and learn a little bit more about what to expect in Paducah.
I am Bonnie Browning, and I am the Executive Show Director for the American Quilter Society, and we're talking to you from Paducah, Kentucky.
That's so cool. And we start out with our first question, so I'm going to ask it to you, even though you're a little bit of a different kind of guest, which is, what's your first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
Oh, gosh. Well, I had a grandmother who used to make quilt blocks. I never ever saw her put them together and make them into a quilt, but she was sitting around in her chair where she'd be sitting there hand sewing, and she did it all by hand sewing blocks together.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. Do you know what happened to those blocks?
I don't, and after she passed away, I asked that question, but nobody seemed to know where they were. I did ultimately get one of her blocks from a cousin who she had lived with in the last years of her life, but that was all I was able to find, was just the one block.
That is so odd, isn't it? Huh. Really interesting. Well, I haven't heard that kind of story before. Super interesting.
Well, and, I think she just did it to pass the time. I'm not sure. She might have done it and donated them to her church.
Yeah.
I really don't know that answer, but I know that she did do a lot of stitching.
And then when did you get interested in quilting?
Well, my mother taught me to sew when I was a little girl, and I learned to sew on a treadle sewing machine, which my mom still has.
Really? That's so cool.
Yes. But I really didn't get interested in quilting until the bicentennial, 1976. And my husband worked for the JCPenney Company, and they ran a contest. And there were contests in several different magazines. And I'd always liked quilts, but I really had not gotten into making any quilts. Well, so at that point, I actually had been at a women's meeting, and you know how sometimes you have these speakers and you set goals? And so we were to set some goals and write them down and seal them in an envelope and then not open them for a while. And my husband got transferred, and we went to Burlington, Iowa. And as I was unpacking things, I found that envelope.
Oh, wait, hold on just a second. Something weird happened. Just a second.
Okay.
Hold on. Sound got weird. Just a second. Let's see. Okay. So as you were unpacking, that's where it just bleeped out on us. So just tell me about as you were unpacking.
So as I was unpacking after we'd moved, I found this envelope, and I opened it up, and I had done everything that I had written down as goals except make a quilt was one of the items I had written down. And I was active in the Welcome Wagon group because I was new in the city. And we had a meeting, and they went around the room, and all the ladies told what they were interested in. And everybody that was there that day said they were interested in some kind of needlework. But our Welcome Wagon didn't have a needlework group. And so somebody said, well, can we start one? And this lady raised her hand and said, if you all want to learn how to make a quilt, I'll be happy to do that. And so the lady then proceeded that once a month we got together and we made a quilt block. Now, the interesting story of that is it was a sampler quilt, so we all made different blocks every month. And I did put those quilt blocks together, but it still is not quilted.
Really?
I learned, like many people do with a sampler quilt, I learned what I needed to learn about making those individual blocks.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't all that important. That it wasn't a terribly pretty quilt. It was it was blue and brown, and part of the fabric was polyester and cotton, which doesn't sew together very well.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of bumpily and lumpily, and so I never have quilted it. I ought to just send it to a long arm quilter and use it for a blanket.
Right. That's really funny.
But anyway, so I learned off of it. And then from there, I was taking some art classes at the community college in Burlington. And one of the projects we needed to do was some silk screening. And so I drew some old weather vanes and silk screened them onto muslin and put that together as a quilt. And so that was really the first quilt that I finished. And I assembled the quilt and I hand quilted it. So that was my very first quilt. And so that was in the late 1970s.
Wow. And
so I've been quilting for a long time.
You have.
And from there, I began doing some teaching at the local art center. And we got transferred to Dubuque, Iowa, and I joined a really active quilt guild there and did some more teaching. And then 1989, I taught here in Paducah for the AQS Quilt Show. And I guess after that, the rest of it's kind of history, because I've literally traveled all over the world quilting. I've been to Japan and Egypt and China and Turkey and Australia. Really, quilting has taken me all over the world.
That's amazing. And when did you? It was as part of the American Quilter Society. Is once you were part of that, or that was independently on your own?
I actually had traveled to a couple different countries before I started working for AQS. But since I've been here, I've actually done a number of things. For instance, we worked with the tent makers of Cairo, Egypt, and while their work is not strictly quilts, it is a needle art.
Right.
And AQS bought over 800 pieces from the tent makers that then we sold in this country for them.
Wow, that's remarkable.
Yes, it is. Well, and at the time, that was after they'd had a revolution in Egypt, and they were not getting very many tourists. And the American Quilter Society really helped them save their entire tent maker industry, which had, Paul in the Bible was a tent maker. And so that's how old making pieces in fabric is.
Yeah. And
they depended on the tourists. And so we really went over there and bought pieces and brought them back here and sold them. And what they learned from that was they had to improve their technique, because our quilt makers were very knowledgeable when they looked at work. And when they were making tent pieces, they could do it fast in stitches 1/4 of an inch apart. And so now they've too learned to make it smaller. And today they're taking their work to Spain and France and England and a number of other countries to sell their work. And so, we like to think that we help them continue making a living to support their families. And it's mostly men who do that kind of work.
That's really interesting. So let me ask you, for those people listening, tell me, what is the American Quilter Society? Let's start there with what it is and what do they do?
The American Quilter Society is the largest membership quilting organization in the world. And we now have over 70,000 members. And they're all over the world. I think the last time we ran a slip, it was like 80 countries outside the United States. And so that's also reflected in the people who come to our shows and who enter quilts in our contest. They come from all over the world.
That's remarkable. And what do you see as the central mission for the American Quilter Society?
Well, it always has been that the mission of the American Quilter Society is to promote today's quilt maker. And we do that in a number of ways. We do it where we have a contest where they can enter the contest and win money. This year alone, 2018, we're going to be giving away over $460,000 in prizes at our 6 shows.
That's amazing. Now, let me ask you a question on that. Can anybody,
Sure.
Do you need to be a member to enter the contest?
No, if you're a member, though, the amount that you have to pay to enter your quilt is less.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, that's one of the benefits of your membership is that you can enter your quilts and have a member fee instead of the general public fee. Or if you come to the show and buy admission or workshops or lectures or anything like that, it's a reduced fee for our members.
And then who can, and I've quilted a long time, but I'm like an average quilter. But who can enter these contests? I imagine that people listening feel a bit shy about, sending off their quilts. Who sends their quilts, and how brave do you have to be to enter the contest?
Well, let me just tell you about the first time that I entered my quilt.
Yeah.
And that was 1986. It was the second year of the show, was the first time I entered a quilt in Paducah. And, I think everybody is sort of like, what if it doesn't get in? I mean, that's what you think, because you don't really know what the competition will be when your quilt gets there.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I didn't tell anybody that I entered my quilt until I got the letter saying it had been accepted. And at that point, I shared with all my friends in my quilting guild that I was going to have a quilt that was going to hang at this show in Paducah.
Very cool.
And lo and behold, I came to the show on a Tuesday, and they were having the awards presentation on Tuesday evening. And I had arrived at the show, and at that time, they printed the winners list on a separate piece of paper. And so somebody had handed me a show book and the winners list. And so I just am looking down the list thinking, oh, gosh, I wonder who won. And lo and behold, my name was on that list. I won a third place ribbon.
That is
so
cool.
Too much, right?
That's huge.
And so you know what? We have people who enter for the very first time every year who win awards. Almost every show, we have a brand new winner that's never entered our show before.
That's amazing.
But it can be anybody.
Yeah.
And if your quilt guild members are telling you need to enter this quilt in some shows, then you need to do it because, they know what's good. They know what good quality quilting is. And they know if it's a smashing design, that they've seen quilts in the magazines of some of these winning quilts. So I would encourage anyone. And if you enter the Paducah shows, and, we do 6 shows, but at Paducah, we spend 2 days judging the quilts. And so we do a written critique of every quilt. Mm-hmm. And so if that's important to you, I would encourage you to enter the Paducah shows. Or the other 4 shows, we judge the quilts hanging, and we don't have time at the other shows to be able to do critiques.
Yeah.
But you still can win at all those other shows.
Amazing. Okay, I've got a couple more questions. So the quilts that are being entered, are they all original works in terms of like they're not using other people's patterns, or are they, using a pattern and saying this is so-and-so's pattern and my interpretation of it? Sort of how much originality do you need to have to enter the quilt?
Well, our philosophy is that we want as many people to be able to share their quilts as possible. And, most of the quilters are using patterns. When some of the people that call themselves art quilters, mm-hmm. a lot of the art quilters are using their own original designs. But, what I call Susie Quilter, those of us who are out there making quilts for our own enjoyment or for our family, most of the people are using a pattern of some kind or another source for a design. And we accept all of those. There are some shows that require the entire quilt be made by one person. But here at Paducah, you know what? We want those people to share. If 2 people worked on it, if 3 people worked on it, they just have to list those people so that the appropriate credit. And the same thing, if they use a pattern, part of the entry form is that they need to list whatever their design source was. And of course, mark original, or they can provide the book of the pattern. Maybe it's a photograph that they used for their source, whatever that source is, they need to list that on their entry form.
That makes sense. That's great. And where does the